Assalamu alaikum and hello to my non-Muslim viewers. Today we're going to be talking about the identity of Dhul Qarnayn in the Quran and, the stories of Dhul Qarnayn and the seven sleepers of Hespus and the whole context of the Quran chapter 18 and why the Quran chapter 18 was revealed and refuting critics like Sam, the scam, Shamoon, David Wood, Christian psychopath David Wood, same David Wood who tried to kill his father with a hammer, was put into a mental hospital by his mother, and the masked Arab. The masked Arab is some atheist troll who makes videos, who's one of those ex-Muslims who makes videos criticizing Islam and the Quran and stuff like that. So this video is going to be me addressing the critics of the Quran chapter 18. Now, who is Dhul Qarnayn? Let's just start with that. It's commonly said by critics of Islam that Dhul Qarnayn was Alexander the Great. So let's see if this holds any kind of merit or not. Alexander the Great was, he conquered most of the lands in the Middle East, Europe, North Africa, Persia. I mean, his empire went all the way from India, which is in the Far East, all the way to Southern Europe and stuff like that. So Alexander the Great was known as a great warrior and a great conqueror and stuff like that. So the legends of Alexander the Great grew as time went on. And then the legends grew to the point where there was something called the Alexandrian Romance, which was written in 200 AD by one of the scribes of Alexander the Great. So, anyways, Alexander the Great also was known, also had a helmet that had two horns, so he was called the Two-Horned Lord, or Dhul Qarnayn. So, but the critics of Islam say that Alexander the Great could not have been Alexander the Great, and the reason why they say that is because Alexander the Great was a pagan. He was a pagan, and that goes against the Quran's theology, and he was known to do he was known to be not a good person, as in he had people worshiping him, and he had other things and other things like that. So there's a lot of cruel acts that he did too. So they say, how can Dhul Qarnayn be Alexander the Great when Alexander the Great was known to contradict Quranic morals and Quranic theology and stuff like that. So who is Dhul Qarnayn? The question really arises: who is he? And to be honest, this is a moot point, because that's not the point of the Quran's. That's not the point of the Quran's revelation. The Quran's revelation of the Quran chapter 18 was to answer the critics. The critics were the Jewish people. The Jewish people, basically, according to Tafsir al-Tabari, Tafsir ibn Kathir, and Tafsir Al Qurtubi, the Jews asked Nadir bin Hat went to the Jews, and the Jews said that test Muhammad, ask Muhammad three things, and if he knows these three things, then he's a prophet. Ask him about the seven sleepers, ask him about the mighty traveler, and ask him about the spirit, the ruh. So the prophet, so then Nadir went back to the prophet, and then he asked him, he told him what the Jews told him to ask the prophet, but the Prophet Muhammad didn't say inshallah, and 15 days later or 2 weeks later he still didn't get an answer. So then after that, Angel Gabriel came, and he recited the Quran chapter 18 to the Prophet Muhammad. So the lesson is to say inshallah. Like, if I'm going to do something, say inshallah I will do it. Like, inshallah I will go to Target, or inshallah I will go to school, or inshallah I will go to work. So there's a lesson behind that. But so anyways, the master was kind of skeptical. He was saying, well, this is the Quranic chapter that gave it all away. And the reason why is because why did it take 2 weeks for the Prophet Muhammad to get the information about the Quran chapter 18? That's not his argument, but that's kind of the crux of what he was arguing. But that's not his main argument. But anyways, Well, to me, this is further proof that he's a prophet, because if the if the Prophet Muhammad was really authoring the Quran, if Prophet Muhammad was really making up the Quran, as some critics say, then why did it take him 2 weeks to get the information? Why didn't he immediately, go to his mysterious teacher, learn the surah, learn the the story of the mighty traveler, the story of the people, the seven sleepers of Espus, and the Ruh. Why didn't he immediately go to his mysterious teacher? Why did it take 2 weeks for him to get the information? Specifically, 2 weeks. So there's also a hadith where the Prophet Muhammad asked Angel Gabriel, why doesn't he come more regularly? And Gabriel said, we only descend on Allah's command. Whenever Allah commands us to descend, we descend. And this is found in the Quran, chapter 19. And this is authentic hadith. So the master Arab says, well, why did this phrase make it into the Quran? And the Quran, and he's missing the crucial point. Allah is telling Gabriel to tell Muhammad that angels only decree by Allah's command. So the Quran, so that verse is Allah talking to Gabriel, is Allah's speech to Gabriel. So it's not Gabriel talking. There's not some dialogue between Muhammad and Gabriel that is somehow made it into the Quran. No, it's Allah telling Gabriel what to tell Muhammad. That Allah's monologue or Allah's speech to Gabriel made it into the Quran. So that refutes that claim. But anyways, getting back to Dhul Qarnayn, the question really arises: who is Dhul Qarnayn? And the reason why I say this is a moot point is because that's not the point of the Quran. That's not the point of the revelation of the Quran. The Quran is basically revealing that there's the known story. It was already known that the story of Dhul Qarnayn was already known in Arabia, before the Prophet and after the Prophet was born. So, but only some Jews knew the story. The pagan Arabs, they were illiterate. They didn't know the stories. Other than Abraham and Ishmael, they didn't know Dhul Qarnayn. They didn't know Moses, Jesus. They didn't know the basic stories of those people, of those biblical figures like Moses, Jesus, Elijah, David, Solomon, Aaron, etc., etc. So they didn't know those basic stories. So basically, the Quran is basically telling an already known story. Like, people already knew the story of Dhul Qarnayn, but the people who knew it were the Arab Jews who lived in Medina, not in Makkah. Remember, the Quran chapter 18 was revealed in Makkah. It wasn't a Medinian surah. So then the question really arises: who is Dhul Qarnayn? Is the Quran historically inaccurate in talking about Dhul Qarnayn? Now, from my research and from my understanding, it looks like Dhul Qarnayn was Cyrus of Persia, not Alexander the Great. And the reason why I say this is because, according to this tafsir of the Quran, this is towards understanding the Quran. English version of Tafsir Al Qurtubi by Syed Abdul Allah Maududi. And again, this is towards understanding the Quran, volume 5. He on pages 127 to 129, he talks about Dhul Qarnayn and who Dhul Qarnayn is, and the travels of Dhul Qarnayn. For example, he gives a map of where Dhul Qarnayn where Dhul Qarnayn was and what he conquered and stuff like that. So the first clue to identifying Dhul Qarnayn is who are the Jews referring to? Now, the Jews in Medina weren't Israeli Jews. They were Arab Jews. What do I mean by that? I mean that there were some Jews who left Israel, who left modern day Israel, and then they traveled and they went to Arabia and they intermixed with the Yemeni Arabs, or the Arabs who were already there, and that produced the Arab Jews. So that's why in these Arab Jews, they had their own version of the Torah, or they had their own version of the Old Testament. That's why we find things in their scripture, which is different from the Old Testament, from reading the Hadith literature, the Tafsir, etc., etc. And Ibn Sa'd and Al-Tabari's history books, etc., etc. So these Arab Jews, keep in mind, Arab Jews, they weren't Israeli Jews. They weren't from the lineage. They weren't from the direct lineage of Aaron. They were Jews who intermixed or intermarried with these Yemeni Arabs, or with these Arabs in the Arab Peninsula. So these Jews knew of somebody named Dhul Qarnayn. Dhul Qarnayn was already in their books. Now, who was the great leader of the Jews of the Old Testament times? It looks like it's Cyrus of Persia. And it couldn't be Alexander the Great. The reason why it can't be Alexander the Great is because Alexander the Great he's not mentioned in the Old Testament, but Cyrus of Persia is. Cyrus of Persia is mentioned in the book of Daniel chapter 8 verse 30, Daniel chapter 8 verse 3, Daniel chapter 8 verse 20. He's also, Cyrus of Persia is also mentioned in the book of Ezra, etc., etc. So, Cyrus of Persia was already known to the Jews at that time. Cyrus was a Persian ruler who rose to fame beginning around 549 BC. He led the Jews out of exile. Exile in Babylon. And further hints that Cyrus of Persia is, if we read the book of Ezra, portrays him as a God-worshipping and God-fearing king who liberated the Israelis by virtue of his devotion to God, and that he also ordered the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem to rebuild for the worship of God. So, according to the Old Testament, according to the book of Daniel, according to the book of Ezra, and I'm going to be putting the verses all below down, the Jews, highly looked up to Cyrus of Persia. And Cyrus of Persia did have a helmet with two horns in it, and I'm going to be posting a picture down below. So it looks like it's Cyrus of Persia who the Dhul Qarnayn is. Dhul Qarnayn couldn't have been Alexander the Great. But you might be asking, well, if Dhul Qarnayn is Cyrus of Persia, then the problems really rise. What about the wall of Gog and Magog? The wall of Gog and Magog is associated with Alexander the Great. It's not associated with Cyrus of Persia. Well, there's two responses to that. One, the response is Cyrus of Persia did build the wall of Gog and Magog, but this later on mistakenly got attributed to Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, and the Alexandrian Romance. The Alexandrian Romance, written in 200 AD, mixed up the story or confused Cyrus of Persia with Alexander the Great. The second response is Cyrus of Persia. Cyrus of Persia was the first person who built the wall. And then the wall got taken down, and then Alexander the Great later on rebuilt the wall. That's also another possibility. So the wall wasn't first constructed by Alexander the Great. What could have happened is Cyrus of Persia could have built the wall of Gog and built the wall to keep out Gog and Magog, and later on Alexander the Great rebuilt that wall. So that's certainly possible, and then that's what the Alexandrian Romance is talking about. That's certainly possible. Now you might be saying, but why is there no records? Why in Josephus and things like that? Why is there no records of Cyrus of Persia? Why is the wall of Gog and Magog always associated with Alexander the Great? Well, the response is, Josephus, these Alexandrian Romance, etc., they didn't get everything historically correct. That's certainly a possibility. It's possible that Cyrus of Persia was the first one who built the wall, but then that got mistakenly attributed to Alexander the Great. That's certainly a possibility. So, the Quran is basically adding extra information about Cyrus of Persia, which these Arab Jews probably didn't know about, that Cyrus of Persia was the first one who built the wall of Gog and Magog to keep Gog and Magog out. And again, this is all documented in this towards understanding the Quran, Volume 5. So, that's certainly within the realm of possibility. So then the question really, so then the second question, the critics also say that the Prophet Muhammad was just plagiarizing, or he's just, he was just making up stuff as he went along. He was just plagiarizing the well-known story of Dhul Qarnayn of pre-Islamic poetry, and he probably learned it from oral sources, and he incorporated it into the Quran, because there were certainly Arab pagans, Arab Jews, Arab Christians, Arab, whatever, or certainly Arabs who knew the story of Dhul Qarnayn, knew the story of the seven sleepers, knew the story, and then the Prophet Muhammad heard those stories, and then he put them into the Quran. Well, there's two responses for that. One, the Quran Islam doesn't claim to bring everything new with it. So if we see these pre-Islamic prayers or pre-Islamic prayers, or these pre-Islamic stories about Alexander or Dhul Qarnayn or Jesus, or found in the Talmudic stories, or these New Testament Apocrypha, or these New Testament, or these these stories about Jesus found in the infancy gospel, and stuff like that. It doesn't mean those stories are legends. The Quran is, it's possible that these were true stories, that the story of Dhul Qarnayn and the story of Jesus speaking in his cradle, and the seven sleepers of Hesperus, these were true stories, but they didn't make it into the Old Testament and the New Testament, and the Quran is basically confirming those stories. So it's possible that these were true stories and they made it into the Alexandrian Romance, or the Gospel of Thomas, or the infancy Gospel of Thomas, and the Talmud, and stuff like that. And then the Quran is basically confirming that these were true stories, because that's one of the functions of the Quran. See the Quran chapter 5 verse 48, and the Quran chapter 20. That's one of the functions of the Quran. You'll see the Quran chapter 5 verse 48, and the Quran chapter 20 verse 99. So the Quran is basically saying that these stories, that these stories from before are true stories, and the Quran is just confirming their authenticity. So just because the Quran mentions stories from or the stories of Dhul Qarnayn, or the stories of David or Jesus or Moses, or that doesn't mean the author of the Quran is plagiarizing these stories. It's just confirming that there's truth in these stories. And again, that's one of the functions of the Quran. See the Quran chapter 5 verse 48 and the Quran chapter 20 verse 99. And what about praying and stuff like that? It's commonly said by Christian and atheist critics of Islam that the Islamic prayer is actually taken from the ancient Persian way of prayer and the ancient Jewish way of prayer. Well, first of all, Islam, like I said, Islam doesn't claim, or the Prophet Muhammad in the Quran, they don't claim to bring everything new with them. Islam doesn't claim to bring everything new with it. So if you see these pre-Islamic elements in Islam, Islam is just confirming that this is the true practice. This is the true practices. This is true practices of prophets before. We read in 1 Chronicles 28 verse 20 that people prostrated to God the way Muslims prostrate, the way Muslims do the sajda. We also read in Numbers chapter 20 verse 6 that Moses and Aaron fell down face down. This is the Muslim equivalent of the sajda. And again, this is Numbers chapter 20 verse 6. This isn't some anti-supernatural liberal Bible. This is I'm reading out the New International Version of the Bible. So people, Islam is basically confirming these Jewish or these Persian types of prayers, that these are true acts of worship. So that's what the point of that is. It doesn't mean Moses is plagiarizing and things like that. So the identity of Dhul Qarnayn, it's kind of a mystery, but it looks like it's Cyrus of Persia, because Cyrus of Persia was known to the Jews. Now you might be asking, well, what about the seven sleepers of Hesperus? what do they have to do with the Jews? And that's not the point. The whole reason why the Quran is revealing these stories of the seven sleepers and Dhul Qarnayn and stuff like that is because the Jews knew these stories. Now, whether these Jews, had these stories memorized or orally, or whether these Jews knew these stories from, from Palestine or from Turkey or Syria or wherever these Jews knew these stories from, whether they reveal those stories as holy or not. For example, the seven sleepers of Espus were Christians; they weren't Jews. But the point is, these Jews, they knew those stories. They knew it. So, and only they knew it, right? So these Arab Meccans, or these the people of Mecca, they didn't know those stories. So the test was that Prophet Muhammad was a real prophet. Then he would tell what the spirit was, what the seven sleepers, what the story of the seven sleepers was, and the story of Dhul Qarnayn was. So the Prophet Muhammad passed the test because Allah told Gabriel to reveal to Prophet Muhammad those stories, and those stories were not known by the Meccans at that time. They were only known by those Jews, because those Jews, they had access to places like Palestine, Turkey, Syria, and those stories certainly would have been circulating over there at that time. Or they knew about Cyrus of Persia, which the Meccans didn't know about, because the Meccans didn't have a copy of the Torah, whatever the Arab Jews' Torah was, whether it was the Old Testament or some corrupted form of the Old Testament, or some kind of corrupted form of the Torah with these stories of Dhul Qarnayn, the spirit, and stuff like that. Now, what about the spirit? The Master Arab also asked that the Prophet Muhammad give vague answers about what the spirit was. Well, if you read the Old Testament, in the Old Testament, the spirit is all over the place. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, Job chapter 26, verse 13, Isaiah chapter 32, verse 15, Genesis chapter 6, verse 3, John chapter 16, 2 Samuel chapter 23, verse 2, Ezekiel chapter 2, verse 2, Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 27, Psalm chapter 143, verse 10. So even the Old Testament isn't clear on what the Spirit is, but the whole point is that according to the Old Testament, and according to these Arab Jews, they knew what the Spirit was. The Spirit was in the Old Testament. It was in the Old Testament in places like, again, the Psalms chapter 143, verse 10, Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 27, Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, Job chapter 26, verse 13, Isaiah chapter 32, verse 15, etc. So even the Old Testament isn't clear on what the Spirit is. But the fact is, the Spirit was in the books of the Jews, in the Old Testament. It's in there in the book of Genesis, book of Job, book of Isaiah, etc., etc. And again, I'm going to put all those verses in the description box below, so you can check for yourself. So basically, the Quran is basically confirming the story of the Spirit. That the Jews knew the Spirit. The Spirit was all over the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, the book of Isaiah, the book of Ezekiel, in the Psalms, etc., etc. So the Jews knew what the Spirit was. So the Prophet Muhammad passed the test because he answered all the questions. Now, the Master Arab and some other critics of Islam will ask, well, why didn't the Quran go into details about the seven sleepers of Espus and the story of Dhul Qarnayn and stuff like that? Why didn't the Quran give a full, detailed account? And the reason why is because, and the reason why it doesn't go into details is because the Quran doesn't need to go into details. The Quran doesn't need to explain every single thing in details. Allah is basically telling Muhammad a very summarized version of the story. Why does the Quran and why does the Prophet Muhammad have to, reveal like full details of the story, and where the cave was, and who Dhul Qarnayn really was, and where Gog and Magog exactly are, and things like and where the wall is and stuff like that. Why does the Quran have to go into details? It's just given a general. It just responded. The whole reason why those stories were revealed was to respond to those Jews, because those Jews knew those stories, whether they wrote down those stories or knew those stories by oral lore in Palestine, where they got it from Palestine, Syria, Turkey, and stuff like that. Is the Quran is basically responding to them. The author of the Quran is saying, yes, I know those stories, and hear those stories. So the author of the Quran is basically responding to a challenge by the Jews. That's the whole point. The point isn't to go into, extreme details on, who Dhul Qarnayn was and the seven sleepers and where the seven sleepers, where their cave was, and what the spirit exactly is. That's not the point. Even the Bible is vague in some stories. Like, we don't know what happens to the disciples. We don't know how they die. Just reading the New Testament, we don't know how they die and where they go after Acts of the Apostles. So even the Bible, even the Old Testament and New Testament, is vague on stuff. For example, the biblical character of Enoch, that's a good example. We don't know anything about Enoch. It just says he walked with God and God took him. So we don't know much details about Enoch, and we don't know much details about other Old Testament figures too, or New Testament figures. For example, Paul mentions people like other disciples that don't even make it into the New Testament Gospels, like Apollos, Junius, etc., etc. So there's all kinds of like vague stories and vague figures in the Bible that the Bible doesn't go into full story details about them. So there's some mysterious figures in the Bible too. So why can't the same thing be with the Quran? The Quran doesn't have to go into extreme detail on who Dhul Qarnayn is or who Luqman is, and who the seven sleepers were and exactly where they were sleeping and where the cave was and stuff like that. Why does the Quran have to go into extreme details? That's not the point. The point is just to reveal a known story at that time, to respond to the critics at that time. So that's the whole point. Anyways, the Prophet Muhammad was, according to many critics, like Montgomery Watt, Sir William Moyer, John Gilch, Glenn Leonard, they say that the Prophet Muhammad was sincere. So if the Prophet Muhammad was sincere, he wouldn't have a motive to fabricate the religion. He wouldn't have a motive to make up or to, plagiarize these stories and intentionally put them into the Quran. So even the critics of Islam say that the Prophet Muhammad was at least subjectively sincere, and he believed that he was that he was receiving revelations from God. So even the critics like Montgomery Watt, Sir William Moyer, who are no friends to Islam, who are critics of Islam, John Gilch, author Glenn Leonard, etc., etc. And again, I'm gonna put all the references below. So even these critics say that the Prophet Muhammad was sincere. So if the Prophet Muhammad was sincere, he wouldn't have a motive to fabricate the religion. He wouldn't have knowingly, included these stories that he heard. So this is further proof that the Prophet Muhammad was sincere, and he wouldn't have. And if the Prophet Muhammad was sincere, as even the critics say, then he wouldn't have a motive to fabricate the Quran. He wouldn't have a motive to make up stuff and put it, or hear stuff and put it into the Quran and stuff like that, and things of that nature. So this refutes the. So the whole point of the Quran, chapter 18, was the author was responding to a challenge by the Jews, and the Prophet Muhammad he passed that test, or he passed that challenge. He revealed what the Spirit was. The Spirit is found in the Old Testament. The seven sleepers of Espas, who only the Jews knew because they had connections to Turkey and Palestine and Syria, where they most certainly would have heard that story. Even though it was a Christian story, but they probably were impressed by it, as Tafsir Ibn Kathir, Tafsir Al Qurtubi, Tafsir Ibn Abbas, and the Syria of Ibn Hisham say that the Jews were impressed by that story. It doesn't necessarily mean that they held that story as holy or whatever. And the Dhul Qarnayn story, these were stories that were known, not only to the Jews of Arabia, but to other places like, Palestine, Egypt, Syria, Turkey, Rome, etc., etc. So these were well-known stories, and the Quran just came to confirm their authenticity, confirm their truth. So the Quran doesn't need to go into details. The Quran is just giving a vague or a general response to the critics who asked. That's the whole reason why the Quran chapter 18 was revealed. So I hope this clarifies some misconceptions about Dhul Qarnayn and the Quran chapter 18 and things like that. Again, I would just recommend, for the identity of Dhul Qarnayn, I would recommend this, Towards Understanding the Quran, Volume 5, by Abul Maududi, and on page 127 to page 129, he reveals, he goes into why it's Cyrus of Persia, why Dhul Qarnayn could be Cyrus of Persia. So I would just recommend this. If I find a PDF format, I'll put it in the description box below. So I hope this clarifies some misconceptions about Dhul Qarnayn in the Quran chapter 18. Thanks,